Okay, this came up last week. Someone, I think it was you, asked about, I was talking about kosher food. I'm sorry if it wasn't.
It was Nancy, she's not here.
Okay, someone asked about kosher, keeping the dishes separate, milk and meat products. And someone said, isn't that yeast? No, that would be Passover. You don't want any leavening to touch anything. Okay? Now, interestingly, I was doing more work on the Herods. I said, there's an MP3 download where they said there were 6 Herods in the Bible. I found a 7th. There were 11 of them. 3 of them are called Herod. I'm serious. I found some more. Agrippa had 2 sisters, Bernice, I think she actually held office, and Drusilla. I'm trying to remember the other 2. Oh yeah, Herodias, she was part of that clan, and her dancing daughter, Salome, who is not named in the Bible. But we know her name from Josephus talks about her. The Salome in the Bible was actually the wife of Zebedee, in other words, the mother of James and John. That's the Salome that's named. The one that's unnamed, the one who danced, we know from, Josephus talks about her. So, it just gets so complicated. And that's part of the issue. We're supposed to study to show ourselves approved, at least if you're going to be a pastor. Paul told that to Timothy in the same book. He said, do the work of an evangelist. It reminds me of reading, you ever see, was it Oswald Chambers? Is it The Utmost for His Highest?
Yes.
You start reading it and man, I do not measure up. You feel like a worm. You start reading what Paul told, you really get to biblical standards, Does every pastor study like that? Does every pastor evangelize like that? That's when you think, ugh, I just don't measure up. Anyway, that was last week. My Jewish studies, here's some other stuff, by the way. Wedding customs. Matthew 25, 1 through 13, the 10 virgins waiting for the bridegroom. That's not how we conduct our weddings, is it? But you've got to understand what they were doing. And John 14:2, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would not have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. This is really just a couple of excerpts from something I'm going to be teaching on tomorrow in my own church, Woodland Park Baptist Church. Or is it Woodland?
It's Woodland Park.
Woodland Park, that's what I thought. I know it gets confusing because there's a Woodlawn Baptist Church in Lenore City, right near the St. Notarius. But anyway, Woodland Park Baptist Church. I'll be speaking on that tomorrow in much detail, explaining what all this is. I mean, you would go, you'd have an engagement to a bride, then you go for maybe a year and build onto your father's house. And the bride would not know exactly when you were going to be showing up, but she knew a general time. Remember, the friend of the bridegroom would arrange a lot of these things. And so you get 10 virgins who don't even know when he's going to come back. He comes back like at midnight, but on and on. But that's just, when we know these things, it really helps us understand the Bible, because it was written in a different culture, different language, different time. Now, how to get sidetracked? Okay, because this is really about Hebrew in the Bible. Story of the missing or added comma. I was in a church in Kenai, Alaska. I lived in Alaska for 7.5 years, lived there twice. This was the second time I lived there, and I actually had a wife that time, whom I brought from Texas, where I met her. So we go to this Sunday school class in this church, and I think they had rented a high school. I was thinking, man, this is a nice big church. They got a Christian school and everything, but in retrospect, it was probably just a high school they were renting. So we go to the cafeteria, which is also used as a gym. They can pick the tables up, and there are 4 people in the class. I mean, there's me, my wife, another young lady, and the guy teaching who looks like he's all of 22 years old. And this was a King James only church. So I said, he said that they had a question. Now, they'd already resolved this before we got there. There was a comma in one King James Bible where there wasn't a comma in another. What's going on? So I said, Hebrew scripture as it was originally written did not have punctuation. Of course, my implication is someone had to decide where to put the comma in. He wouldn't look at me. He looked right down the aisle like this. He says, I'm such a King James believer, I'll believe we'll be speaking that in heaven. And he was serious. It gets nutty. I
Wow.
have met pastors that you talk about the Hebrew, the Greek, they can't even hear you. But anyway, now, Mayor Cagle. This is him. This picture was taken in 1979. I don't know who took it, but they all gave us copies and I scanned mine in. And I now have it hanging up where my little home office on my computer. He's Polish Jew. He escaped into Russia when the Nazis came in. He told us his story. It was quite something. And then they put him in a camp there in Russia. Not a well, like a POW camp. And he says, well, you know, we're cursing the revolution. He's telling us this in Hebrew. It was quite a story, and he finally made it to Israel. This is an ulpan. It is a Hebrew study. Ulpan is loosely translated sometimes as studio, but it's really an intensive Hebrew study program. Now, they probably have some in the U.S. You can even get some online. But the kibbutz ulpan, this is at a kibbutz. It's an agricultural collective built on Marxist principles. Come May Day, they flew the Israeli flag and the red flag of Marxism. Now, they're much less Marxist now. Marxism hasn't really worked out for them. But that was how they were originally established. When Israel first became a nation, it was maybe 25% of the population lived on kibbutzim. That's the plural. From each according to his ability to each according to his need. And it was great because it's the only time Marxism has actually worked. I mean, you didn't have a boss making all the money. You didn't own a car. You know, if you wanted to use a car, you put in to use a car. They get together at night and decide who was going to do what job the next day. You had rotations. Let's say you had to wash dishes maybe for 3 months, no matter what your job was. If you were a member, you know, you did. They call it duhonut, rotations. You know, there was 3 months you had to do dishwashing, whatever. But this is a country where everyone gets drafted when they're 18, and even the doctors and the lawyers have to go through it. Okay. Of course, you're not going to be a doctor or a lawyer when you're 18, but then you got reserve duty every year. At least it used to be till I think 55 if you're male, or 26 or female, or 26 or marry, whichever comes first if you're a female. I don't know the exact numbers now. And then you got reserve duty 30 days a year. 1 year they were thinking of extending it to 40. But everyone there's been in the service unless they have a criminal record or they can't handle it physically and mentally or something. But anyway. The Ulpan is a program originally designed to teach Jews coming into the country. Now the kibbutz is maybe 2 or 3% of the population. There are 270 kibbutzim spread out amongst 3 or 4 movements. But the Ulpan was originally designed to take Jewish immigrants in and teach them Hebrew. You've got Aleph Bet, which lasts about 5.5 months. And you study Hebrew 4 hours a day, you work 4 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sunday is like any other day. And they'll also take, at least the way they did it when I was there, probably when it originally started, who knows what it was like, but some old people that might still be alive. But basically, they send you to their kibbutz. They take trips every now and then. It was called a tiul. Might be 1 day, might be an overnighter, might be even 2 nights. And they send you once per program to a seminar to their kibbutz movement headquarters where you got to learn about their movement, etc., in your native language. So they send you by pairs, First time I went with a Canadian girl because she spoke English. And they send like 2 Dutch girls along, and on and on. The Ulpan these days, and it used to be free. These days you got to pay. It tends to be often more Gentiles than Jews. People they know aren't going to stay. I think if they really know you're going to stay, like you've come from a country where it's real tough on Jews, they still won't charge you. But now you can get on, and different kibbutzim will host it at different times. They also have other types of ulpanim, that's the plural, where you go beyond this, and they're probably in the cities. I have a friend that's taken a couple of others, but you really get intensive Hebrew. They start teaching you Hebrew from day one. It's the only language you've got in common. So it is taught in Hebrew from the very beginning. by a teacher. Now this guy would try to learn any language. I mean, he tried to learn Farsi because there were a bunch of Persians. He could speak a little English. My first Ulpan teacher, this is my second Ulpan. First Ulpan teacher was from Hungary. And she actually knew a few words in English, but her native language would have been Yiddish, I assume. Probably Hungarian too. And she had come in, I think, illegally, sneaking by the British gunboats. I heard that once. Now I've learned when you hear something, try to confirm it. But there really are some interesting stories from way back in the 40s. And this is 1979. Now this is the second one, for me, is the Ulpan Gimel. It's your second 5.5 months, and that's as far as the kibbutz normally goes. I wish they do it. It takes you 2 years to get citizenship. I wish they have enough, and they do have more Ulpanim, but I wish they do it on the kibbutz, because Hebrew is a language based on roots, and if you try to learn it from, after this year, 2 5.5 month programs, it would be nice if you could actually really get into the roots and just learn a whole lot more. But anyway, this is the program. Now this is 2 classes here, because a lot of people are taking Aleph Bet. It's their first one. I'm taking Gimel. That's the second one. And I think a couple of these might have just been from the program right before. Sometimes these young people will hang around and become volunteers on the kibbutz. They're not members. This, I think, was a teacher. This was my teacher. He might have taught the Aleph Bet. She was what they call the mitapelet. We speak English there. We use Hebrew words for the, it's the caretaker, but we just call it the mitapelet. Like you bring your clothes, which are watched communally, to her and stuff like that. Actually, when they started the kibbutz, everything, you didn't own your own clothes. And from what I've read, women started complaining they really wanted their own blouses. And they finally got to a system where you put a number on your clothing and then you get it back because it's all done communally. By that point, they used to have jeans day. Jeans was such a hot item, they get stolen. They had to guard the jeans, I guess, when they washed them. I paid the equivalent of $25 for some blue jeans. And the rivets started coming off after a couple of weeks. Israeli made blue jeans. They're much better now. I'm not sure what they do. But anyway, France, I'm not sure. Persia or Iran, I'm not sure. Holland, she's from Holland. He's a French with a PhD, I'm not sure. America, Russia. I think these two, these would have been married Americans. America, Persia. Can't even see that face. I think she might have been another instructor or something. I'm not sure. Persia, Finland, America. America, that's me, America. Finland, Persia, I'm not sure. America, she's half Arab. She's got relatives in Ramallah. She's now living in Seattle, last I knew. Probably Holland. She's from this way out place that you hear about around here. It's called Kentucky. I think Russia. I'm not sure. These are mainly Persians. This was my roommate. He had been a captain in the Shah's army. He showed me a black and white picture of him with his uniform on, probably blocking some views. And what happened, this is 1979, that's when Khomeini took over and said, we don't need the Jews here. So it got really uncomfortable, and a bunch of them left. And they were really a disgruntled bunch. I mean, these are educated people with careers that had to just leave everything behind because some dingbat takes over the country. Okay? And I remember him complaining to my teacher, he's got a cousin there or something, he can't practice his profession. And these guys, they had a reputation. Oh, she's from Colombia. Him, I think Persia, not sure. I think Persia. Yeah, I remember him. I remember some of these conversations. Let's see. The Persians, he mentioned, can't practice his profession. They're all on these, basically working. Now, they did have 2 factories there. But you're spending a lot of time in the farm fields. And these guys are professionals. They didn't like that. The Persians were known to be a disgruntled bunch. And in another, I heard when I went for that seminar in Tel Aviv, because they sent me to a seminar for their kibbutz movement. Someone saying, the Persians all just went, walked home or something from their job. I mean, they were really a disgruntled bunch. It was difficult for them. And at least the rest of us probably wanted to be there. Russians, they kind of got driven. Well, in those days it was hard to get out of Russia. You had to push hard and hope you didn't get in trouble for it, lose your job and all that stuff. It's interesting talking to the Russians. One of these Russian ladies, now where is she, was complaining. She's in class, and remember this is all in Hebrew. She says, when we graduate, you know, we put on these white robes and we go to a lake, blah, blah, blah. And someone said, what about freedom, or something like that? She said, no. Now that's a word with about 200 translations I've read. It can mean well or let's go or whatever, a bunch of things. In other words, so what? So we get, you get freedom, but it was really, every now and then a Russian would turn around and go back. And they thought it was better in Russia. This is frontier Israel. It could take you months to get a telephone. Right now Israel's they're higher tech than we are. They're more advanced technologically. We are no longer the most technologically advanced country in the world. Probably never were. We might have been tied with Germany at one point. They have higher cell phone penetration. Of course, it's a small, compact country. It's easier to get certain things up and running. Imagine trying to get across the Great Plains on electric power and stuff. They're considering battery exchange stations now for their vehicles, electric vehicles. I don't know how far they've gotten. But they got more companies on the NASDAQ than anyone else, I think, except the US. I think that's how it works. Very high-tech country. Not back in 1979, it wasn't. But the thing is, you take a 5.5-month program, you speak in it somewhat. You do very little reading, it's mostly talking. And I took the second program there, because that was my second time in Israel. And they open up Bibles, okay? Now these are Hebrew Bibles, Old and New Testament. And the teacher told us he had some missionaries or somebody had come through and given it to him, and he just kind of laughed at the idea that the New Testament was in there. But we started reading in Hebrew, and this is ancient Hebrew, but once you know the language, it's kind of like, a little bit like King James English. It's the same, but it's not the same. There are more differences, but it's not too hard. These people that say, well, it's a completely different language. Well, how come we could learn it in a day? In a sense, you open up the Bible and you can actually read it. So it's not a completely different language. I mean, you look at some old forms of English, you don't even know what you're reading. But with what Hebrew I knew, which wasn't the greatest, we could still pretty well pick out what was in there. And anyway, evangelical Christianity has been accused of being a mile wide and an inch deep. Well, where do you get depth from? Thinking, knowing things, including language. This is going to be public. Remember leaving a church with my family. One of the reasons was the Sunday school teacher could not answer questions. He knew the syllabus in front of him and that was it. That was one of the reasons. But it's great. I mean, now, of course, it didn't teach us any Greek. But, of course, you're in there and you see the land around you and you're seeing things. My first time in Jerusalem, and which was 1975, I'm looking at this stuff I've never seen before. I grew up near Boston, so we're all, green woods and all that, and it's so much, everything's built out of wood, and it's really different in Israel. A lot of it's built out of stone. And it was beautiful. Once you get outside of course, the city itself, in a sense, there's a certain part where you look down, you see these old, like Arab villages or something, and say that was more like what it was in the day of Christ. You just have to forget the cars and everything else. And then my first time there, my first program, 1975 to 1976, I remember telling my roommate, this is just beautiful. And he was from Ohio. He said, it's just like home. Well, when you're from Boston, that's different. But we get so sidetracked with that idiocy. We get KJV only to the extent we were not supposed to consider original languages. Now, when I was a kid, I would take pictures. I loved photography. And the black and white film, the old 127 roll film. But what gives you more information? Here's the Tulip Festival, the Wooden Shoe Tulip Farm and Vineyard in Woodburn, Oregon. This is not a real windmill. I've seen the real thing. I lived in Holland for several months. And it's too small, it's not turning, and it's a profit. It looks good, okay? And look at all that color. Now I take the same picture and electronically just said, show it to me in black and white. See? This, folks, is the King James Bible. this is the original. What gives you more information?
The original.
Yeah. Often we use philosophy instead of exegesis. Now, I'm not, philosophy is a weird word. I get a PhD in chemistry, doctor of philosophy. Yeah, so there's Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Merkin. It's kind of funny reading that. Doctor of Science is not available in the United States. You have to go to Europe for one of those. And that's beyond the PhD. The PhD is a terminal degree here in the US. One guy told me, because I was arguing with him, he was a King James only person, what part of thou shalt not kill is hard to understand. And what I surely should have said was the kill part. Because you have that's Exodus 20. Exodus 21, you have 4 crimes that require capital punishment. Okay? And of course you have warfare, which God commands. And self-defense is never doubted. The only thing you could do is go into the New Testament where Jesus said, put the sword away. He that picks up the sword shall die by the sword. Often misquoted now, he that lives by the sword shall die by the sword. Basically, we can kill. Well, the word kill, it's not in there. It's thou shalt not murder is a better translation. Look at the Hebrew word. Look where and how it's used in the Bible. Even that, it's not necessarily exact because it mentions one time, if you murder somebody, you get murdered. You got to learn to think like the ancients. I remember someone arguing, thou shalt not kill. I think it was in public school. Why we shouldn't have capital punishment. Next chapter is capital punishment. Killing for murder, smiting a parent, kidnapping, which was what the transatlantic slave trade was all about. You kidnap people from Africa, and then cursing a parent. Okay? Then the Bible needs to be interpreted through the lenses of history. I say this time and time again, original culture, original audiences, and original languages. And of course, there are other verses and passages. See, we get into most of these heresies that you run into, they're built in a philosophy. Because the argument, of course, then God can shed more light on what we read. Well, I got the Bible and the Holy Spirit. Well, there's a whole lot more the Holy Spirit can do if you actually know what you're reading. And when I say philosophy is because when you get in arguments with people, well, don't you think God would have a perfect English language Bible? That's not exegesis. Why do we have Wycliffe Bible translators? Because there are people that don't even have the Bible in their original language. Probably not too many anymore. King James was one of a bunch of translations. And that's one of a bunch of languages. But it starts out philosophically. I actually do a presentation on 6 heresies in the evangelical church, and they're all basically based on philosophy. Don't you think, no, let's exegete instead of thinking. God would have something, that's a bunch of pompous American arrogance is what I call it. We're Americans, we speak English, so God has to supply a Bible for us in our native language. We need to consider, again, original languages, original cultures, original audiences, and history, much of which the original readers of the Bible knew. Why does the Bible not differentiate between Philip the Tetrarch and another Philip that were both sons of the same father but different mothers? Probably because everyone back there knew. They knew when Herodias divorced Philip to marry Herod Antipas, it was a scandal. It cost John the Baptist his life to complain about it. People would have known. It didn't have to say not Philip the Tetrarch. See, Philip the Tetrarch wasn't the guy. He was another half-brother of, Herod Antipas. Herod, again, I mentioned this last week, had 2 wives named Mariamne. He had 2 sons named Philip. He got married 10 times. So it gets really complicated just understanding that clan. If you think the Kennedys get a little complicated, or the Bushes, President Bush said this. Well, which President Bush? George Bush. 2 of them. The one that went to war in Iraq. It's both of them. Okay? Now, I come from the land of the Kennedys. You can tell by my accent. It gets a little more complicated. Which Kennedy? Herod? Wow. 7 things the Hebrew clarifies. Excuse me if I look at my watch. I don't want to be late for work. Okay, puns, including baby talk. acrostics, inflections, meanings of names, polysemy, and I had to look that one up, show you where my English is. Oh, it was polysemy, no, polysemy, poetry, and other clarifications. Let's look at some of these. Here's a pun. You know puns, you see James Bond movies, they use them all the time. Sometimes a little colored, or off color, but anyone would call it. But anyway, they're in the Bible. I don't think there's any in the Greek, New Testament, but the Old Testament. And Samson said, with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of an ass have I slain 1,000 men. Judges 15:16. Here's a pun. It's a complicated one, where Samson uses the same word for heap as he does for ass. Here's another one. Micah 1:10-15 lists several places in the southern kingdom of Judah. What cannot be seen in translation is that the words mean things that are tied in with puns in these verses. For example, look at Micah 1:10. Declare ye it not at Gath. Weep not at all. Weep ye not at all. In the house of Ophrah, or Aphra, roll thyself in the dust. The Hebrew word for dust is Aphra, revealing a pun. In the house of dust, roll thyself in the dust. The city was called Aphra, but it meant dust. So it's a pun. The pun is when you have equivocal meanings of a word. You know, what is it? Ben Franklin said, if we do not...
Isn't that more of an idiom?
No, an idiom is a word, you know, means a little different than you think. A pun is when you take... Ben Franklin. Wasn't he the one that said, if we do not hang together, we shall all hang separately? Hang is being used in two ways. And that's what a pun is. Equivocal, meaning equal voice meanings. Yeah, Franklin said that. Okay.
You use them all the time, Jack.
Yeah, I know. I know all about puns.
Okay. The inhabitant of Zanan came not forth in the morning at Beth-Ezel, from Micah 1:11. Zanan and came forth are from the same or similar roots. It's a pun. Therefore thou shalt give presents to Moresh that God. The houses of Achziv shall be allied to the kings of Israel, Micah 1:14. Achziv and lie are from the same root. Not the same word, but the same root. By the way, Achziv, when I was there, Achziv is a town, I don't know how it stands these days. Just a little place by the coast, really beautiful, where a couple decided to secede from Israel. And it's just a tourist place. I'm sure they were doing their military duty when they had to and paid their taxes, because the Israelis would not have tolerated anything else. But just this young couple, you know, we're going to secede from the country, and you know, you could go in there and tour their little house and everything. But yet I will bring an heir unto the inhabitant of Mareshah, from Micah 1:15. Heir and Mareshah are from the same root. Now, here's one, because it gets quoted so often. Whom shall he teach knowledge? In whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Am I blocking your view? It's a tough, okay. Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breasts. In other words, adults. For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line upon line, here a little and there a little. Isaiah 28:9-10. It appears to be a pun. Here's why. Here's this is a decent translation, but it also could be baby talk. Okay? In Hebrew, Kitzav latzav, tzav latzav, kav lakav, kav lakav, be'er sham, be'er sham. Okay? It seems to be like gaga gugu gigi. Okay, remember Amy Grant?
Yeah.
He's a fat little, I'm not a singer, he's a fat little baby, wah wah wah. He wants his bottle and he don't mean maybe. He sampled solid foods once or twice. But he says doctrine leads him cold as ice. Okay? The spiritual baby. In Hebrew, one can see that verse 10 is probably baby talk. Gaga, gugu, gigi. What is God saying? Look at verse 9 again. Whom shall he teach knowledge? In whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breasts. Verse 10, the next verse, but you're a bunch of babies. That comes up in the New Testament. I have fed you with milk and not with meat, which means like solid food. Meat, by the way, in the Bible typically is not flesh. Okay, now, Greek I'm not as familiar with, certainly in the Old Testament, in Hebrew. Meat we think of as hamburger, but it means food, at least in the Old Testament. For hitherto you were not able to bear it, neither yet now are ye able. 1 Corinthians 3:2. Remember, Paul's talking to a carnal church. He says, I'm giving you milk. You can't take what adults can take. Look at this in Hebrews. We don't even know who wrote Hebrews. For when the time ye ought to be teachers, for the time ye ought to be teachers, you have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. Hebrews 5:12. The days before Similac and baby bottles and all that junk, he went from breast to regular food. Maybe crushed up at first, but... Okay? So it seems to be, you're a bunch of babies, and you see that message in the New Testament also. Amos 8:1-2. Thus hath the Lord showed unto me, and behold, a basket of summer fruit. And he said, Amos, what seest thou? And I said, a basket of summer fruit. Then said the Lord unto me, the end is come upon my people of Israel. I will not again pass by them any more. Summer fruit and end make what is close to a pun in Hebrew, in that they come from either the same root as similar roots, therefore sounding similar. Kaitz is summer fruit, and ketz is end. Acrostic. So those are some puns. You don't see them. They don't get through the translation process. It doesn't change any doctrine in the world. Or actually, none of this does. But it shows you what the ancients were thinking. Acrostics. Now, what it is typically each verse starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet or something like that. By the way, just as a note, which is a bit of a rabbit trail, an abbreviation is USA, okay? We don't say USA. An acronym is UNICEF, UNESCO. When you say the word, well, actually, this isn't so much a rabbit trail because Hebrew loves using acronyms. They hardly ever use abbreviations. They might, like the word doctor, they'll use an abbreviation, at least modern Hebrew. But there are a lot of acronyms in Hebrew. The virtuous woman of Proverbs 31:10-31. You know, who shall find a virtuous woman? Here's Proverbs, as they say, is written for boys. And what you're seeing is, this is the woman you should look for in life. I married her. It's 22 verses, 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Each verse starts with a subsequent letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So 31:10 starts with the aleph, goes right like that. Each verse starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. I don't even think Dr. Seuss is what we call him Seuss. He finally started calling himself Seuss because everyone else did. Theodore Seuss Geisel had to call himself Dr. Seuss because he was in trouble with the law. Didn't want people to know who he was. Something like that, yeah. And he called himself doctor because, as a joke, I think originally he was over in England. I don't think he ever got his doctorate, so he just used it as a joke. But anyway, I can't remember him ever doing anything like that. And most of his books are trash. And they're really stupid. They just dumb kids down. But if you ever read You're Only Old Once, which is written for people our age, it's a riot. And On Beyond Zebra, I used to read to my brothers when I babysat them as a kid. My parents would go out on a date. But he doesn't even do this that I can remember ever. One fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. Puns. Whoops, no, I hit the wrong button. Acrostics. Psalm 119, with more verses than 14 Old Testament books and 17 New Testament books, verses 1 through 8, each start with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, 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 Aleph. Then bet, 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 okay. 8 times 22 is 176. Does not get through the translation process. 8 verses, each of which start with the first letter of the alphabet. Then each verses, each which start with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Does not get through translation. Sometimes they say it's right in the center of your Bible. Remember, the Jews ordered their Bible differently. The books, same books, different order. It ends in 2 Chronicles. So that works in English, I guess. But in Psalm 112, each letter begins a line. Not a verse, but a line. Remember, the verse numbers came later anyway. In Psalm 145, basically each letter begins a half verse. Some of these are not absolutely perfect. Psalm 25 is almost a perfect acrostic. What you run into sometimes is the Hebrew letter kuf has very few letters, with very few words that use it, or especially start with it. As I was looking these up, I think one of them, like, they couldn't find anything for a kuf. But anyway, Psalm 34 is almost a perfect acrostic. A vav is missing in that case. Psalm 37 is almost a perfect acrostic. Psalm 111, it's an acrostic but not verse by verse. Now, Lamentations. When's the last time you heard a sermon on Lamentations? Because we don't know what we're reading. Plus, it's really depressing. Question?
Yeah, I want to ask you, is that like when you're learning in the kindergarten? A is for apple, B is
Yeah.
for boy. So did they do this, was the use of the acrostics, was that an intentional teaching
Probably.
method, or was it just a coincidence? I don't think it was.
Probably. Presumably. Remember, Matthew was written to the Jews. And the ancients, especially the Jews, seem to believe that you can learn by sevens. So remember how Matthew starts the genealogies 14, 14, 14, but when you really look at the Old Testament, he skips 4 kings. He's going to make it fit no matter what, probably because it's easier to learn. See, we've all got books these days, even digital now. Back in those days, how many people had these scrolls? So it's probably a learning aid.
So you don't think it was like for poetic flair, like
Well, maybe
alliteration?
both. Maybe
Just
both.
like beauty.
Poetic beauty, and it's probably easier. I use, when I took U.S. History 1, I mean, I would use, what do they call them, mnemonics to learn. They're memory aids. So I take I think it was 7 things about the Jamestown colony that I had a 60-point essay on and I remember coming up with the word spewlam, S-P-E, maybe W-L-A-M, and each of them was a different aspect of the Jamestown colony. So it was probably both. Poetic flair, plus it made it easier to learn. It's how they would study it, maybe group study. Not everyone carrying their Bibles, like these days. But Lamentations 1, 2, and 4, each with 22 verses, each letter begins a whole verse. Now, Lamentations 3, which is 66 verses long. The first 3 verses each start with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, 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 Bet, Bet, Bet. Verses 4 to 6 each start with the second, and so on throughout the chapter. Chapter 5 is 22 verses long, but there's no acrostic. So it goes 22, 22, 26, 66, 22, and then 22. Acrostic, 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 big one, 3 and 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. Acrostic, no acrostic, but still 22 verses. Now, but there's more. The Hebrew letters all mean something. Hebrew alphabet, ayin, which means eye, comes just before pei, which means mouth. The eye comes before the mouth in the Hebrew alphabet. Chapters 2, 3, and 4. Now, not chapter 1. Chapter 1's perfect. Chapters 2, 3, and 3 is the one with 66 verses, and 4 each have these 2 letters reversed, so that pei, the mouth, comes before ayin, the eye. And you have to think, that here's where rabbinics can come in, at least, what did the rabbis think? Why? Maybe if you figure it out, it helps you preach Lamentations.
Mm-hmm.
Notice this is not numerology. This is not saying, Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, and let's figure out that when the Messiah is coming. Because Kabbalists would do stuff like that. Allergy time. You can't catch it. And it's nothing tricky like that. It's not like, like I've mentioned originally when I spoke here, how many second advents and raptures have I survived in my lifetime? I have lost count. I literally have a bunch of them in a book I wrote, and there's been more since then. But this is not numerology. What are the questions? Why? Oh, thanks. I actually got my water back. Well, actually, I have to take this because I can get through checkpoint with this. I open my own water. I can't get through checkpoint with an open bottle. Inflections. gender as needed. You know, the Song of Songs, okay? We call it the Song of Solomon. And it's the Song of Songs. Shir HaShirim Asher Shlomo, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, or at least attributed to Solomon. They're not quite sure of that word. The thing is, it gets confusing, so it's not preached on a whole lot. Plus, it's kind of spicy. You know, what do you do with something like that? And I'm going to move this up just for the sake of the filming. My first Bible. Well, first when I got saved, I bought today's English version, which back in those days was only the New Testament. Now I know that Good News Bible has now been expanded into the Old Testament. I wanted a full Bible, so I went to the bookstore. I was a student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and then for $5.29, I think it was, plus whatever tax was involved, I bought a Jerusalem Bible. And this was before the New Jerusalem Bible came out. It's a Catholic Bible. It's got the Apocrypha, which Catholics and Orthodox and Anglicans believe are part of the Old Testament. Some Anglicans are starting to consider it then deuterocanonical. In other words, not quite canon, but anyway, it had all that. And the Song of Solomon is interesting in that Catholic Bible, okay, because it'll say like daughters of Jerusalem. You know, I think it was a colon, you know, and the bride, the bridegroom. It puts in notes so you know who's talking to whom, because sometimes it gets really confusing. It's not so confusing in Hebrew, because if I say your book, and I point to a woman and say your book, that's different in Hebrew. 4 ways to say your. Masculine singular, feminine singular, masculine plural, which can include a mixed company, and feminine plural. So it's in the Old Testament is very inflected. Modern Hebrew, they kind of sounds a little more like European languages in some of the grammar that they've changed, or it's grammar and syntax. But the thing is, without those notes, it's like who's talking. In Hebrew, it's much easier to see, because let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for thy love is sweeter than wine. Well, thy love, it's going to be different if it's man's love or woman's love, because thy is going to be different, which is just an ending on a word, the way they inflect it. You put the possessive pronoun in the Bible, in the Hebrew, on the end of a word. Modern Hebrew only uses that now for family relations, maybe old sayings out of the Bible or some rabbinical literature. By the way, in the Bible, in Hebrew, the verb comes before the noun. In the beginning, created God the heavens and the earth. It doesn't change any doctrine, but the verbs comes before the noun. It's not that way in modern Hebrew. It's like ours. And this is one of the reasons people hardly preach in the Song of Solomon. They don't know what's going on. And they don't even know who's talking to whom sometimes. It gets confusing. It's not as confusing in Hebrew. Meanings of names. Names of the 12 sons of Jacob. Let's just take an example. They all had names for a reason, and it states it in the Bible. In Bilhah, Rachel's maid conceived again and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali, which doesn't mean anything. Unless you say, well, Naphtali means wrestlings, or actually my wrestlings. But in Naphtali, Elohim, Naphtali, from like Naphtali, Elohim, which means God, but it can also mean great. Niftalti, I wrestled, imachoti. Okay? You see that Naphtali 3 times in Hebrew. You only see it once in English. Again,
in that verse?
In that verse.
The word Naphtali is in there 3 times?
1, 2, 3. Now, not exactly Naphtali, means my wrestlings, but the same root.
Same root.
We do it, actually roots in English too, run, running, ran, whatever. But it's Hebrew, it's more so that, and all 12 sons, now he had a daughter he called Dinah, and they didn't say why. But the sons all have names for a reason. Actually, they didn't say why Benjamin got his name. But it's translated son of the right hand, or sometimes son of the south, because they would look to the east to look at directions. Well, he was born in the south.
Son.
Naphtali means wrestling or my wrestling. So the root appears 3 times in this verse. And all the 12, well, most of the 12 sons are like that. These wives were bringing up kids to this polygamist. By the way, you go to Israel now, you can find Arabs with 4 wives. Sharia law allows that. Okay, I might have to go to the West Bank, and there can be a lot of jealousy. Men instinctively think from the belt down. But basically, when you're an adult, it doesn't matter anymore. You only really care about one wife. You look at David. All those wives, okay, he only really, in a sense, had one that he was attached to, ultimately. I remember Moshe Dayan's 500-something odd page autobiography in English, because he wrote in Hebrew, it was translated. And he had some friends that were Arabs. He says, oh yeah, some guy, I think he said it was at his side when he knows some Arab friend that died with his favorite wife by his side. When you're old, you realize you're only supposed to have one wife. Of course, in those days, you had more women than men, because men got themselves killed in battle a lot more easily than women did, so you had all these excess women running around. What else is there to do? Become a prostitute? Polygamy beats prostitution, and I think that's why God allowed it for a long time, or at least for a while. Polysemy rhymes with polygamy. The coexistence of many possible meanings for a word or phrase. Okay, naked in Genesis 1:25. Adam and Eve were naked. And subtle, right after that, Genesis 3:1, the serpent was subtle. It's the same word in Hebrew. It's the same word. It might mean that there are different meanings for that word, and there might be something else. Naked and subtle there, it's the same word. Noah's Ark, Teva, in Genesis 6:14, uses the same Hebrew word as the ark that Moses was put in, not the ark that Moses built. Okay? It's something that floats. And they still use teva for certain things these days, or especially ahon in modern Hebrew, like a clothing closet and stuff like that. Notice that they both floated, but it's a different word as the Ark of the Testimony. That's ahon. Very different word. An example of 2 Hebrew words being translated by 1 English word. So before you had 2 English words and 1 Hebrew word, now you have 2 Hebrew words and 1 English word. There are more examples of this than this. Yeah, I always wondered about first fruits. You get first fruits and you get first fruits. So how many times can you have something that's first? Third feast, first fruits. Then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest. Raichi kitza chem. That chem means your, plural, masculine, by the way. Unto the priest. 7 verses later, the 4th feast, Pentecost, they are the first fruits, bikurim, unto the Lord. Very different word. So it's not as confusing in Hebrew as it is in English. Doesn't mean we understand exactly all of that, and people still argue, the tithe was it, 23% total, and because you tithe every 3 years, on and on it goes. But to try to figure this out, realize it's not even the same word. It's just the problem is it's the same word in English. Poetry, let there be light. Oh, you've got to see that one. God said, let there be light. Okay, let there be light, and there was light. Okay, let there be light, there was light. It's exactly the same in Hebrew. What does that tell you? Well, early Hebrew was simple. As you go on through the prophets and stuff, it seems to get more complex. It could mean, God says it, and that's that. You could really see that. God said, let there be light, and there was light. What God says, that's that. You can see that more clearly. Grass. Let the earth bring forth grass. The grass is used twice. Let the grass. Something like that. You see the word twice. It's just different. Ecclesiastes 7:1, a good name is better than fine perfume. It's a play on words. Name is Shem. Perfume is Shemen, which really is usually used to mean oil. By the way, there's someone on Facebook that I know from when I was a kid. She's Jewish. And when she talks with me, good communication, she doesn't even say God, she says Hashem. She writes this. Told you last week that Jewish people they'll often find ways around using the word God. G-D for God. But she writes Hashem. And we have good communications. I'm not complaining at all about her. Okay, a chiasm. Tov, Shem, Mishem, Tov. That's what it is. A good name is better than fine perfume. Hebrew, by the way, especially biblical Hebrew, uses fewer words. Okay, fewer words maybe than modern Hebrew, especially than English. It just takes fewer words. In the beginning, that's 3 words in English. That's 1 word in Hebrew, Bereshit. But chiasms, I read once that there might be 2,000 chiasms in the Bible. And you see them all over the place, except maybe the epistles, because those are written to Greeks and Romans, for the most part.
What's a chiasm?
Chiasm is when you're going up a hill and you're going downhill, okay? And it really gets interesting. Matthew 10, when Jesus sends people, his 12 apostles, you look carefully. Animals here and then animals there. Wise as serpents, harmless as doves, and stuff like that. What it is, here's an example. When Adam and Eve commit their sin. Adam, where are you? Where art thou? Well, the woman that thou gavest me. The woman blames the serpent. Okay, Adam, woman, serpent. How does God respond? Serpent, woman, Adam. Okay? Psalms has got, there's like a classic one, but it's very evident once you know how to look for them. Because it's got probably just so Eastern or so Semitic, we don't think that way in English. We're Greeks in our thinking to a large extent. We want things in order. Remember Luke, he was either a Greek or a Hellenistic Jew. In his gospel, he says, I'm going to show you things in order. He said twice in order at the very first chapter of Luke. That's Hellenistic thought. That's the way we like to think. Semites were different. It wasn't always the order that mattered, and their order would change. Like if I tell you something about my life, I'm going to start in the back and move up to the present. Semitic thinking is more like, let's go backwards instead. And it's all over the Bible. You look at Revelation, walking in the midst of the 7 candlesticks and 7 stars in the right hand. I've actually mapped it out at home, just on my computer. It goes in one order, and then as he talks to the churches, the order seems to reverse itself. All over the Bible. Again, probably not the epistles. But there's a lot of that. It's poetry. And the earth was without form and void. This rhymes in Hebrew. Tohu vavohu. That's modern Hebrew. Probably you'll hear like bohu if you take a seminary course, usually taught by a PhD in Hebrew that can't speak the language. I've met 3 of those. 2 were seminary professors, 1 was just a woman that had just gotten the PhD in biblical Hebrew and still couldn't speak it. I wouldn't say only in America, but it rhymes in Hebrew. Now Martin Buber, he's Jewish philosopher, and Rosenzweig translated the Hebrew Bible into German from scratch, rather than simply taking Luther's Bible and using some different words to make it more Jewish and less Christian. They used German words that rhymed for this verse, words hardly ever used in German. They had to use it because it rhymes in Hebrew, and we're going to make it rhyme in German. You got to realize Bible translations, part of the issue can be doctrine at times. We translate according to our doctrine or church tradition at times. There was a real battle with, Scripture pointing to Jesus Christ. The Jews had the Haftarah, these prophetic writings that they read. Remember Jesus in the synagogue opens up and it's talking about him? When I was bar mitzvahed, I had to read from the Torah, 5 books of Moses, plus a Haftarah portion. That's from the prophets. There's an old Haftarah that they found overseas, which includes the messianic verses. This really shows from the Old Testament Jesus is who he said he is. Those verses are missing in modern Haftarahs. There's been a lot, so other clarifications. God, God gave me a great helpmeet or something, helpmate. Doesn't say that in the Bible. It's a helpmeet for him in Genesis 2:18. Okay? And in 20, in the King James Version, help is a noun. Meet for him is one word in Hebrew, kanedgo. He gave him a help, a noun, like as fitting for him, however you want to translate that. It's not a help mate as if it's a modern version of help meet. You know, that meet is not, you know, we say, oh, it must be modern Hebrew, modern English must be help mate. In the Old English, it was help meet. No, in the King James, it was help meet, but it's help meet for him.
You mean sufficient for him?
Yeah, sufficient. That might be kanedgo. You could say sufficient. You know, as befitting him, however you want to translate that. So there's no real help mate. There's a help. But we see this help meet and just say, oh, it must be help mate. What I love is when someone's reading the Bible and teaching a Bible study and, you know, diverse temptations. It's diverse. What are we talking? Skin diving or scuba diving? It's diverse. English just didn't use an E all that, you know. You look at a real King James Bible, the real thing, you're going to have problems reading it. Gothic font, final S's, and the words are spelled differently. And yes, the Apocrypha are in there, not for your edification, but because King James translators were Anglicans. And as far as they're concerned, the Apocrypha are just part of the Old Testament. You know, King James, we go to 1611 King James. No, you don't. Not if you don't have 1 and 2 Maccabees in there. Not if you don't have Tobit in there. Mitzvah versus mitzpeh. I used to think, why is this sometimes mitzvah and why is this sometimes mitzpeh? Well, it's the same in Hebrew. Probably whoever translated that section or something. You know, here, you translate this book and I'll translate that book, you know. Because it's the same. It's mitzvah, by the way. I think, or mitzvah, I forget which it even is. But you actually have to look it up in Hebrew and realize it's the same thing. It just gets, you know, in King James, sometimes it's mitzvah, sometimes it's mitzvah. Yes?
So if you get married, it does matter, the name tag, right? It could change the whole way you look at your wife.
You mean if she takes your last name?
No, it's Mizpah versus Mizpah.
No.
Miss, are you a Mizpah or you missed that?
Original language of the New Testament is Greek. Now, you could say a whole lot of things about Greek. I'm sticking to the Hebrew, but that doesn't dismiss the Greek. Rise, Peter, kill and eat in Acts 10:13. Arise, Peter, slay and eat, Acts 11:7. It's the same in Greek. It's the exact same. Look it up. Of course, we're talking about Hebrew, but people get confused, and then someone asks a pastor or a Sunday school teacher or a Bible study leader a question. They don't know how to answer. That's what gets me. When you ask someone in a Bible study a question and they preach a sermonette and they don't even answer the question. They have to show they know something. I've run into this type of thing before. Or someone asks you a question, you don't know the answer, so you just bring in something else to show that you're not a complete idiot or something. Other clarifications. God forbid, hey, isn't that using the Lord's name in vain? It's not in there. It comes up time and time again. God forbid, but the word God isn't even in there. Chas v'chalila. Word God isn't in there. It's just, they think it kind of means God forbid, so that's how they translate it. Noah in Genesis, it's actually Noah. It's not the same as Noah, daughter of Zelophehad in Numbers 26:33 and 27:1. That's when God mentions female inheritance rights. Here was a guy with 5 daughters. He died. He did not die in sin because of that rebellion in the desert. And we, 5 daughters, want some inheritance. We don't have any brothers to inherit. It came up there, and then it came up to 26:30. No, and I remember this being, I thought it was several chapters apart. 27, I might have to correct those numbers. I think it was like 27 and 36. So I know I've got numbers messed up there. Numbers 27 and Numbers 36. So somewhere or other I hit them wrong key. But the thing is, that is Noah. It's a woman's name. Noah is a man's name. Conclusion, knowing something about Hebrew helps in understanding the poetry and the meanings of the names of the Old Testament. Hey, all those names mean something. David means beloved. I mean, they all mean something. I don't know if there are any exceptions. You know, they often end in ah, you know, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Well, in Hebrew, that's actually the Yah, you know, Yahweh. Not everyone knows Hebrew, but you can learn from those who do. This argument, well, no, we're going to have to come to you, is as if, you know, no, I'm not setting myself up as a pope if I say, why don't you look it up in Hebrew, or I can maybe explain it to you. Some people, it's like, if they have to come to you for advice, they're just, it goes against their theology. Yes?
I think it's in Ezekiel, I'm not sure, it says they're gonna have a pure language. It says there's gonna be a pure language. You know what I'm talking about. It mentions this as, like, there's going to be truth that will be straight from God, I would say, right? A pure language.
Yeah, I mean, the language of Hebrew is actually called the language of Canaan. It is probably something they got trying to trace it. I mean, there's actually a book on why biblical Hebrew is not a language, and I remember looking into it, but I've seen it probably twice. Trying to figure out how these languages developed is not always easy, and it seems to have been a Canaanite language. Remember, it's a Semitic language for sure. You know, it's cognate languages like Arabic, which uses a different alphabet. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know the answer.
Did Moses write in Hebrew?
They have got old inscriptions where the Hebrew alphabet was different. Before it was, some people will say it was aromatized. Probably did. I don't know. You know, he's coming out of Egypt. People who have been there for 400 years. It's hard to know. It's interesting. It's a very good question. And as we excavate more and more of these things become obvious to us, you know, clear, but that one I don't know. Yes?
It's referring to him, it's Zephaniah 3:9. It says, For then I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they all may call on the name of the Lord to serve him with one accord.
Yeah,
Zephaniah
I don't know what that's going to be. I literally, you know, if that's millennium, who knows? What are we going to speak in heaven? Well, King James English, according to one teacher. I don't know.
I don't know about that.
No, I don't either. I really don't know.
No, so since we'll all come together as one.
Any more questions? Hopefully I didn't go too fast, but the thing is, there's a lot there, okay? And I'm not saying I am the expert to come to. You know, I try to learn these things. But there's a lot there that you can learn from. Yes?
This is maybe the most important question. If I was to go and look for a Bible that is Hebrew
Yeah.
translation, tell me what would be a good one.
Hebrew, in other words, translated from Hebrew?
Well, you know, there's a bunch of, like if you go to a Messianic
Yeah.
church, synagogue, they're going to be reading not out of the King James Version.
Praise you, Jesus.
They're reading out of, to me, a Messianic Hebrew translation Bible.
Well, it should be.
They don't read out of the King James Version.
Oh, but they're reading English out of the message.
They're reading an English
Yeah.
language, but it's
That's an interesting question because
It's like a Hebrew to modern English
Yeah.
language rather
Well.
than Hebrew to King James to NIV to, you know.
yeah.
so where are we going to get like one? It's like a Walmart, one
Right.
shop, one place to shop. You know,
I would say I use King James. Now I'm certainly not a King James only cultist. That's what it is. King James used formal equivalents, pretty much word for word. In other words, if this is what it is, this is what we write. Dynamic equivalence is you're just trying to stay true to English as opposed to Hebrew or Greek. or whatever language you're translating into. This is formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence. I prefer formal equivalence. King James does show you the difference between singular and plural you. You know, ye, you, your, that's plural. Thee, thy, thou, thine, that's singular, which does show up in Hebrew and Greek. I like it. What it was is people always knew basically that for a long time King James was probably the best translation, but they knew where the mistakes were. Along comes Peter Ruckman and didn't have any mistakes anymore. And so our minds got real messed up with Ruckmanism, where people try to rationalize what has been mistranslated. And that's just insane. But personally, I use King James. Now, there's the thing, there seems to be more than one set of ancient scriptures. Don't forget Hebrew. Our oldest Hebrew documents probably go back 1,000 years. You look at the Septuagint, you're going back further. And that's where maybe some stuff gets cleared up. We probably, I'm serious, it's like David, you know, his son Absalom has a conspiracy that goes on for 40 years. Well, wait a minute, the Bible's very clear, David reigned for 40 years. That conspiracy was one part of his life. From what I've read, the Latin Vulgate and the Septuagint and the Syrian Peshitta all say 4 years. My Hebrew that I get online has got a bunch of parentheses where they know there are misspellings in Hebrew and they correct it. Here's what it says, here's what it should say. Okay? I would say consider something, if you really want to know what a word means, sometimes you go back to the Septuagint because it's older. Our Hebrew writings just don't go back maybe more than 1,000 years or so. And it's a difficult question. Again, no major doctrines are changed, and even translations are so-called self-correcting. You know, you get, well, all these variants. You know, King James translators sat down with all these different variants. They had to try to figure out which was the one. I use King James, but I look at the original. And the disadvantage is in memorizing things which are harder to present to kids. You know, wist ye not? Huh? Thou dirt, you know, they dirt's not or something. So I'll use different, like I won't say in evangelism, marvel not that I say unto thee, ye must be born again. I would just paraphrase it. Don't be surprised that I tell you, you have to be born again. It's that difficulty. And English is changing. When the King James was originally written, a lot of English words had different meanings than they do now. So we're reading according to the 1611 version, when some of the words have actually changed meaning in English. So that, you know, meat, at least in the Old Testament, you keep seeing meat and then you look it up in Hebrew and it's food. Well, back in 1611, it's probably the word that they used. To us, meat is hamburger and steak. But I don't know. I know a guy, a librarian, with a master's in master's of science in information science, I think it is, MSIS, and an MDiv. He actually sat down and wrote his complete translation of the Bible, and then someone broke in his house and stole everything. He's the one guy in the world I trust for this. I know him. He's very hardworking. He is not the least bit proud, and he knows more than most people. But he's been at this all his life, and he teaches Greek and has taught Greek for years. I just stick with the King James, and then I look up the original, and that's the easiest for me.
Well, what do you think about the New King James? Because it corrects a lot of the...
I haven't looked much at it. It might be a good idea. See, then there's the argument, you know, some of the older so-called original scriptures have certain verses removed that maybe the regular King James has got in them. There's that whole argument, and I'm not expert enough to be able to comment intelligently on it, except to say I don't know. I think some people get into it with their emotions. In other words, they're going to prove something even if it's ridiculous, which is what Ruckmanism does. Here's your thesis. King James is perfect. So now you have to say when something is obviously been mistranslated, come up with a ridiculous statement like, the Holy Spirit deceived the apostle in order to correct it later in the King James Version. I've actually seen this. And it just gets crazy. But I don't know enough about it. So I'm going to have to claim ignorance and not perpetuate anything that's not true. Okay, yikes, I gotta eat and make it on time. Thanks.